Okay, so here we're going to be looking at the global response to 9/11, and we're going to first begin with this particular section here, this joint resolution from Congress, which is going to pretty much define a lot of the powers that the United States is going to be able to use on a global scale. So here they reference the 9/11 attacks, where such acts continue to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat. This isn't like World War I, where you're fighting in a trench, they're fighting in a trench, or World War II, where you know where the enemy is located. This war requires something different. And here you see that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred in September 11th. Wow, that seems to be significant. There's such a gray area with this one. Let's use, for example, Saudi Arabia. It's been long debated whether or not Saudi Arabia has any connection to the 9/11 attacks. Keep in mind, majority of those hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Keep in mind that there have been numerous studies about Saudi Arabian operatives and money getting funneled into supporting the 9/11 hijackers. And so let's just say, for example, with Saudi Arabia, with this language, if we can determine that Saudi Arabia is a nation, or let's say you have an organization in Saudi Arabia and they have planned, authorized, committed, or aided the attack, you know, that the President of the United States is going to have the authority to use any necessary and appropriate force against you. So let's take the case with Afghanistan. So in Afghanistan, the Taliban is in control, and you have the Taliban allowing Al Qaeda to operate physically within their borders. So the president now has the force, the power to use necessary and appropriate force. And so let's see. Afghanistan is a nation. They have an organization there, Al Qaeda, and those people have been determined to plan, authorize, commit, or aid the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, which would mean if the president wants to start bombing Afghanistan, he can. So that's the significance of this piece. So ultimately, what this is doing is giving the president power to do what he's ultimately going to do. Hence the topic here, the global reply to terrorism. So here we see President Bush, 14 September, on top of the pile after the Trade Center attack in New York City. And Bush is going to come up with what becomes known as the Bush Doctrine. And the Bush Doctrine is rooted in some of the ideas here about harboring and helping terrorists abroad. Let's take a look at some of the events that are going to focus on Afghanistan. So the U.S. demands that Afghanistan government hand over bin Laden. That is never met, and as a response, by the time we get to October 7th, the United States starts bombing Afghanistan and threatens more attacks. Keep in mind the Bush Doctrine is about harboring terrorists. He identified nations like North Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan as part of the overall, axis of evil. Now, keep in mind when we use the phrase war on terror, it's an umbrella term. Many things count within the war on terror. And again, the ends justify the means. So Iraq ultimately is part of the bigger war, which is the war on terror. Afghanistan, same thing, part of the bigger war, the war on terror. The torture memos, part of the bigger war on terror, all of that stuff. So it's an umbrella term that allows, general loose language to justify just a host of powers that are going to be able to be used. We already addressed the Crusade comment, which was made here September 17th when Bush was said something about, this crusade is going to take a while. We mentioned that already, in a prior class. Bush addresses Congress, and he outlines his foreign policy. And so, for the most part, like I said, his foreign policy is going to be about preventing terrorism before any sort of response or attack can take place in the United States. And that's a pretty gray area. A lot can be done with that loose language there. So we want to remember that in the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in the 90s, in that particular situation, the United States was involved in a peacekeeping force to try to push Saddam's military back into Iraq. So why does that matter? Well, we're looking at a timeline of events for Iraq post 9/11. And so when we're looking at this particular slide here, the United States moves into Afghanistan in '01. Bush is going to claim that Iraq is part of the axis of evil. We already know that the Bush doctrine is starting to develop, that umbrella term where they're going to be able to go after anybody harboring, helping, aiding the terrorists in any capacity. Congress issues a vote on Iraq, and before you know it, Colin Powell is going to the United Nations to make his claim to the world to suggest, that there needs to be something done about Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein would be captured in '03. Here we see some resolutions going back into the '90s. So these resolutions, again, they go back to the post-Iraq invasion of Kuwait in the '90s, and the significance here is that Saddam Hussein was apparently going to make a nuclear bomb. And as a result of that, in the '90s, this UN resolution said that they were going to allow access to sites designated by the Special Commission. So for the most part, if this is Iraq and these dots represent, potential missile factories, Saddam Hussein's making a rocket, he's trying to, get uranium and make some sort of bomb, whatever it is that he's doing. The Special Commission is going to want to be able to have the authority to go into these facilities and investigate to determine if this individual is complying with the UN resolutions. So as we notice here, refusal to cooperate constitutes a flagrant violation of Security Council resolutions. So all of this stuff in some way does matter for the post 9/11, because with the Axis of Evil declaration, Bush is saying that, by seeking a weapon of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. So the belief was always that Saddam Hussein was going to make a nuclear bomb, and that nuclear bomb was either going to be used against the United States or be given to terrorist cells that would use those nuclear bombs against the United States. As a result of that, we already know that if you're helping planning any sort of attack in the broader war on terror, then that means that your nation, runs the risk of the President of the United States using force to stop you. And so that's pretty much what's going on. Here we see this national report strategy from '02. Underline some of the items here. It's always about protecting the American people. It's about countering the threats, acting preemptively, which means before Saddam Hussein can nuke the United States, we want to get him out of power or deal with that threat prior to that happening. And so that is pretty much the idea here. And we already have resolutions from the United Nations that suggest we can monitor and inspect. And that seems to be the issue here with regard to Saddam Hussein and the United Nations and the US. And so here's kind of what this image is trying to get you to think about here. It's looking at the UN weapons inspectors, and it's looking at what ultimately is going to happen, if they're going to inspect, and look for those weapons of mass destruction. But it's odd because eventually it's concluded that Saddam Hussein did not possess weapons of mass destruction. So what you're looking at here is an image of UN vehicles, and they're pretty much going throughout Iraq trying to determine whether or not Saddam Hussein did have the capability of a nuclear bomb, or was it almost in the position to obtain a nuclear bomb. And the conclusion by this survey here is that no, that this individual was not, which would pretty much say that the United States invasion of Iraq was based on a false belief. So this image I've selected because it shows Colin Powell going to the United Nations to try to claim suggest the U.S. evidence that Saddam Hussein is trying to make a weapon of mass destruction. So we see one of the buildings in one of his presentations here. And I always remember, he's talking about all of the materials that Saddam Hussein had to try to, act as evidence for a weapon of mass destruction. In the end, we see a situation where the United States started to shock and awe, or pretty much was a bombing of Iraq. Military forces had come in. The statue of Saddam Hussein was removed April 9, 2003. Bush declared victory on May 1, 2003, and apparently was laughed at later on because, he flew in on this aircraft carrier and changed his uniform, and the left had a field day with him. Anyway, that's it. A little bit on the global response to 9/11.